Okay, let's unpack this. We are about to do a deep dive into a topic that challenges, I think, maybe the single most foundational assumption of modern science.
I think you're right.
We're talking about the age of the universe itself.
Welcome back. And yes, if you thought we've tackled controversial topics before, today we are really strapping in for a cosmological confrontation.
It feels that way.
And we should be clear, this isn't framed as a simple, religious versus secular debate. The sources are presenting this as a rigorous, almost forensic audit of the evidence.
Forensic audit, I like that.
And it demands that we confront what we think we know about time, about history, and where that knowledge even comes from.
The sources you've brought today, they offer a stunning challenge. They're pitting the conventional 13.8 billion year narrative, what pretty much everyone calls the standard model,
Right.
against this 5 and 3786 year initialization model. Our mission here is to really rigorously audit the underlying epistemology, the theory of knowledge behind both of these timelines.
And what's so fascinating here, what the sources emphasize over and over, is that the critique of deep time isn't rooted in just, simple denial or faith.
No.
It's anchored in very specific mathematical flaws, persistent cosmological paradoxes, things like the Hubble Tension, which is a huge deal right now.
A crisis, they're calling it.
A full-blown crisis.
Yeah.
And then there are these specific genetic constraints, like something called the waiting time problem, that really demand we re-examine that core assumption of uniformity over deep time.
And we're looking at two completely different kinds of signals, aren't we? The standard model, as the sources point out, it only maintains its stability by relying very heavily on what philosophers of science call promissory materialism.
That's a great term. So for you, the listener, what does promissory materialism actually mean in this context?
Well, it means the model's ultimate success is based on the promise of future theories that, that don't exist yet. For example, it explains away the absolute weirdness of the singularity at time zero by just promising that a future theory of quantum gravity will eventually solve it.
Sometime later.
Exactly. It fills the huge observational gaps we have right now, like that mismatch in the expansion rate, with these completely invisible dark placeholders. Dark matter, dark energy.
Things we can't see or detect.
Right. So it's essentially banking on future, totally unverified scientific breakthroughs just to prop up the current structure.
Versus the initialization model, which, as the sources lay it out, appeals to something called functional maturity.
Meaning the universe started ready-made.
Exactly. Like an architecturally sound structure, fully operational from the beginning, and it's anchored to the certainty of what they call a witnessed horizon.
And that's the key. The 5-7-86-year timeline we're going to examine is presented as a precise legal constant, secured by a continuous chain of custody. It's not vague folklore.
Not at all. So let's start with the most basic question. Why is just looking at the present not enough to figure out the past?
That takes us right to the fundamental issue that the sources raise. They call it the illusion of objective history. We all kind of assume that physical science can just tell us what happened in the past, but the sources argue that, that reconstructing the past is actually an impossible task for science alone.
Why is that?
Because it constitutes a non-unique inverse problem.
Okay, that phrase, non-unique inverse problem, is highly technical. Let's really unpack it conversationally.
Please.
Think of it like this. If I gave you the final result of a calculation, say the number 20, you know the outcome. You have the answer.
Right, 20.
But how did we get there? I mean, did we add 10 plus 10? Did we subtract 80 from 100? Did we multiply 4 by 5?
There's an infinite number of ways to get to 20.
Exactly. The result, the number 20 is like the current state of the universe. It's what we can observe today. But the path we took to get there, that's the historical trajectory.
And we can't know the path just from the answer.
Precisely. In physics and information theory, the current state is what's called a degenerate value. It's a single outcome that could have been reached by an infinite number of previous trajectories. The present simply contains insufficient information to deduce a singular, unique history.
So the implication here, and this is something historians of science have pointed out, is that the choice between these two timelines, it's not actually compelled by the data itself.
No.
The choice of a long uniformitarian timeline, this idea of slow, consistent, gradual changeover, a systemic shift, like a sudden initialization event, that choice reflects a philosophical preference.
It's a preference for gradualism. It's not a scientific necessity.
You're choosing your starting assumption.
You are. The uniformitarian approach, it presumes this bottom-up additive timeline. You start with primordial dust and
Yeah.
you slowly build complexity over billions of years.
Whereas the initialization model proposes the opposite.
The complete opposite. It suggests the cosmos began in a state of maximal functional information, a ready-made system, which has subsequently been running down subject to entropy.
But both models can theoretically account for what we see today.
They both satisfy the current boundary conditions, absolutely. But the gradualist model requires inventing billions upon billions of unobserved intermediate steps.
The sources use a great analogy for this. It's the difference between looking at a really sophisticated Swiss watch
Okay.
and assuming it evolved atom by atom from a pile of metal filings and dust over millions of years, or assuming it was assembled by an engineer 5 minutes ago and is just, ticking now.
If you choose that first assumption, you have to invent all those unobserved steps.
You have to. If you choose the second, you just skip right to the moment it started functioning.
And this choice, this philosophical starting point, brings up the issue of coordinate relativity and what the sources call the arbitrary origin.
Right. Back in 1916, Einstein established that the laws of physics are the same, regardless of your frame of reference. You can choose any coordinate system you want to measure things.
And we see this principle in action constantly.
We do. For example, when NASA calculates trajectories for its missions, like the New Horizons probe that went to Pluto, they use what's called a Pluto-centric reference frame. For the purposes of their calculations, Pluto is the stationary center of the universe, and they calculate everything else relative to it.
So if physics allows us to use Pluto as an arbitrary center for measurement purposes, the source material asks a really pointed question.
Which is?
Why can't the actual witnessed birth of the system be the origin point for the time calculations?
Instead of some theoretical point billions of years ago?
Exactly. The 13.8 billion year figure is simply the result you get from an equation where your fundamental starting axiom is assume everything started from dust and evolved uniformly.
The sources make a highly provocative, but I think a deeply insightful analogy here.
Let's hear it.
They say calculating the age of the universe that way is like calculating the age of a 20-year-old man by assuming he evolved atom by atom from primordial dust.
Wow.
Instead of just acknowledging he was born as a human being 20 years ago. The math might be internally consistent with physics, but the result is what they call a hallucination of duration.
A hallucination of duration. That's a powerful phrase.
It's an intellectual exercise of just integrating the laws of physics backward into a void, which gives you a number. But that number measures your assumption, the assumption of a dust-to-man transition, not the actual witness time that has passed since the system became operational.
The sources argue that the obsession with this number, this mathematically derived figure, borders on what they call a mass delusion.
That's a very strong claim. They even call it idolatry dressed in a lab coat. How do they justify calling the attachment to the 13.8 billion year figure idolatry? I mean, what is the listener fundamentally confusing, according to them?
Well, they argue that the core definition of idolatry is mistaking the creation for the creator. Or, in this very specific case, mistaking the method of measurement for the creation itself.
The ruler for the king.
The ruler for the king. The 13.8 billion year figure is a result produced by one specific measuring method. Extrapolation, assuming uniformitarian laws.
And when that measurement method is elevated to an inviolable ultimate truth?
Overriding historical evidence, overriding genetic constraints, and cosmological paradoxes, then the method itself becomes the final authority. The ruler has become the king.
That completely recontextualizes the debate. So let's look at the actual beginning, the boundary condition. Both models have to deal with a boundary condition, what the sources call the parity of miracles.
Right. When we talk about the standard model's singularity at time equals 0, we hit a hard wall. The equation is just that they break down. Physical quantities become infinite.
Which is a problem.
It's a huge problem. Defenders will argue, oh, this is just a temporary failure of our current math. But epistemically, what it means is that at the temporal origin, the laws of nature cease to function. It is the ultimate causal gap.
Okay. And since the laws of physics break down, the standard model has to accept that the universe somehow emerged from a state of lawlessness or pure nothingness through some totally unknown non-causal mechanism.
And the source material has a label for that. They call it a stochastic miracle.
A stochastic miracle.
A stochastic miracle. It means an uncaused initial event where the output, which is a highly ordered, unbelievably fine-tuned universe governed by incredibly precise constants, cannot be derived from the input, which is chaos or nothingness, using any known laws of physics.
It's a random, uncaused event that just happens to be perfect.
That is the claim. And the alternative, the initialization model, accepts what it calls an architectural miracle. It reads a singularity must exist, a moment when the system began, but it defines that moment as the initialization of maximal functional maturity by an external non-contingent agent.
So the choice, then, is not between science and a miracle.
Not at all. It's between two types of boundary conditions. The skeptic accepts the stochastic miracle, that the initial physical constants are uncaused and just emerged randomly.
And the initialization model accepts the architectural miracle, that uncaused initial maturity was the starting state.
And this is where the argument of Wittgenstein comes into play. If science permits uncaused initial constants, the precise values for gravity, for electromagnetism, the speed of light, to define the physics,
Then it has to be logically consistent.
it must logically permit uncaused initial maturity to define the system's history. To dismiss the architectural miracle while accepting the stochastic miracle is, as the sources claim, it's just an arbitrary distinction born of metaphysical preference.
It's a preference to place faith in what they call the idol of chance.
Yes, a blind, deaf deity that supposedly possesses the creative power necessary to establish highly complex, functionally mature systems from absolutely nothing. This distinction is the core epistemological fracture we have to address.
Okay, so if the deep time model were accurate, the sources argue, it should be robust, it should be internally consistent. But as we transition into these cosmological anomalies, we immediately run into persistent contradictions.
Starting with the crisis in deep-time cosmology, highlighted most recently by the Hubble Tension.
The Hubble Tension is one of the most critical challenges facing the Standard Model right now.
It really is. It describes a severe disagreement over the universe's expansion rate, the Hubble constant, and it has reached what's called a 5 sigma discrepancy.
And for you, the listener, a 5 sigma discrepancy is the threshold for a scientific discovery.
That's the gold standard.
It means there is only a 1 in 3.5 million chance that this difference we're seeing is just random noise. The math isn't just slightly off, it is diverging significantly from observation. It suggests the core model is breaking.
To be specific, the predictions that are based on the early universe, which are derived from measurements of the cosmic microwave background by the Planck satellite, they suggest a slower expansion rate.
But the local measurements are different.
The local measurements of objects, particularly using supernovae data, suggest a much faster rate. These two clock measurements simply do not agree, and it's forcing cosmologists into a really painful dilemma.
And this is where the source material introduces the concept of the Standard Model's protective belt. To maintain that 13.8 billion year stability in the face of this crisis, the model invokes the dark sector.
Dark matter and dark energy.
Exactly.
The dark sector is precisely the theoretical bandage the sources refer to. These entities supposedly make up 95% of the reality of the universe.
95%.
Yet they are entirely unobserved. They only interact, supposedly, through gravity. They act as placeholders, whose parameters can be adjusted infinitely to mathematically stretch the expansion timeline, effectively resolving the Hubble tension, but only on paper.
It's a crucial point of critique raised by philosophers of science. A model that requires a 95% fudge factor, invoking entities that cannot be measured or falsified, it effectively surrenders its empirical claim.
It does. If any observation contradicts the model, you don't reject the core theory. You adjust the invisible parameters of the dark sector.
Which means the 13.8 billion year figure is now largely just a mathematical necessity of the theory, not an empirical discovery validated by observable reality.
This failure of the timeline is amplified by the sheer age of the structures we are now observing. We are facing a maturity crisis, revealed by the James Webb Space Telescope.
With GWST.
Standard evolutionary models of cosmology absolutely require, that early galaxies be small, simple, and built slowly over vast timescales.
But that's not what we found.
Not even close. The JWST surveys delivered a shock. They found massive, highly evolved galaxies. They've been dubbed red monster galaxies within the first billion years of the supposed timeline. These structures had Milky Way-level stellar mass.
And the problem isn't just that they existed so early, it's the speed.
It's the rate at which they must have formed. The theoretical limits on star formation efficiency in those early metal-poor cosmic epochs, they were exceeded by up to 400% to create such structures so quickly.
So the sources argue these are basically impossible structures.
Under the assumption of gradual, uniformitarian buildup, yes, they are impossible.
The implication for the initialization model is pretty clear then. These structures suggest that functional maturity was an initialized boundary condition, not a temporal achievement.
They look old not because they took billions of years to build, but because they were started in a state of maturity.
Which brings us back to that famous question, the distant starlight problem. How can light from galaxies billions of light years away reach Earth in just a 586-year timeline?
Right, and the initialization model addresses this using the principle of holographic initialization.
So let's expand on the atom analogy the sources use here. Adam, when created, was not a microscopic fetus that developed slowly over time.
No, he was a functionally mature human being.
He had blood already circulating in his veins, hair on his head, fully developed teeth. He didn't spend decades accumulating those features atom by atom. He started complete.
And the cosmos is treated the same way. The universe was initialized with starlight already in its manifolds as a functional necessity.
So the light wasn't a record of billions of years of travel time.
No, it was an intrinsic component required for immediate thermal and gravitational equilibrium. The measurement of distance, which we then translated to time by assuming the light traveled uniformly, is actually a measure of the system's necessary functional depth.
That's a profoundly different way to view measurement. You're measuring the informational maturity required for the system to exist stably.
Not its chronological duration since some singular chaotic beginning.
And moving from that cosmological scale down to Earth, we encounter the same broken yardstick in geochronology.
Here the source material argues that the secular academy commits what they call an act of intellectual theft by conflating operational science with historical science.
Okay, let's define those terms. Operational science is the repeatable, testable science we use in a lab, right? The ability to predict a chemical reaction in a test tube.
Correct. And historical science, as we discussed, is that non-unique inverse problem, trying to reconstruct a single past trajectory from the present degenerate state.
The sources claim that the success of operational science is fraudulently used to underwrite the extrapolation of those same reactions over billions of unobserved years.
They argue that historical science is like a crime scene where the initial conditions are lost to entropy, so the observer is forced to invent those initial conditions. The predictive power of a model is strictly limited, and once you integrate backward beyond that witness horizon, the result is, according to the sources, a measure of the extrapolator's own arrogance.
And this leads to the practical failure of the dating methods themselves. The sources call it the circularity of calibration, or the parasitic loop.
Yes, radiometric dating is often presented as this autonomous, independent proof of deep time, but its accuracy relies heavily on external historical reference points.
Carbon-14 dating is the classic example, isn't it?
It is. It relies on the assumption of a stable atmospheric carbon-14 production rate, but we know that rate varies wildly, so C14 requires calibration.
And that calibration is done against external chronometers like tree rings, dendrochronology, which are themselves cross-calibrated against historical records, like the Egyptian king lists.
So you've created a single self-calibrated scale. It's not a convergence of independent clocks. It's one system checking itself against its own internal data.
And when the dates contradict the expected deep time narrative,
that's when the sources cite the process of discordance filtering.
Which is a devastating criticism. What is it?
Discordance filtering is the manual discarding of radiometric dates that do not conform to the expected evolutionary timeline, usually based on so-called index fossils.
Is there a specific example of this?
A landmark case is the KBS tuff controversy in the 1970s. Radiometric dates of this volcanic rock layer ranged wildly, from 2.6 million all the way up to 200 million years.
A huge range.
A massive range. And these dates were repeatedly discarded until one was finally found that satisfied the expected 1.8 million year evolutionary timeline, which was based on pig index fossils found in that same layer.
So wait, the rock is dated by the decay rate, but the reading from the decay rate is only accepted if it agrees with the fossil that the evolutionary assumption already placed there.
Exactly, it's a parasitic loop. The assumption dictates the result, creating a metric artifact of what they call calibration coupling, rather than independent verification.
And we see physical evidence against this idea of gradual accumulation everywhere, don't we? Specifically with the polystrate fossil problem.
The fossil problem. For the listener, these are vertical fossilized trees that cut through multiple distinct sedimentary layers.
And in the standard geologic column, those layers, the strata, are supposed to represent millions of years of gradual accumulation and sedimentation.
But organic material, like a tree, decomposes rapidly. The preservation of a vertical tree extending up through layers, supposedly spanning vast epochs, it requires rapid burial.
It has to.
As the geologist Derek Ager, a uniformitarian himself, noted, the geologic record is more a record of occasional violent events than of calm uniformity.
So the conclusion drawn by the sources is that the geologic column doesn't represent gradual chronological accretion at all.
No, it represents hydrodynamic sorting during a rapid, high-energy fluid event. In other words, a global flood.
The layers reflect differential buoyancy and drag coefficients. Material is sorted not by age,
But by size, density, and shape, as has been demonstrated in laboratory experiments. What looks like a chronological timeline is actually a record of hydrodynamic sorting, rapidly deposited by vast turbidity currents, which completely falsifies the gradualist assumption.
Okay, so if the physical clocks on Earth are broken, if they're showing us minutes where we assume there are millions of years, we have to ask if the clock of life itself is equally flawed.
And this leads us directly into the code of life, into genetics, where the mathematical collapse of gradualism becomes, according to the sources, unavoidable. We're talking about the waiting time problem.
This is one of the most rigorous constraints in all of population genetics.
It is. It quantifies the statistically prohibitive duration required for a specific functional genetic feature to emerge by chance and then become permanently fixed in a population. It's really the Achilles heel of gradualism.
To understand why it's such a problem, we need to focus on complexity. Most functional biological systems, the things that actually give a creature a survival advantage, are not single nucleotide mutations.
They're multinucleotide. They require a specific sequence of 2 or 3 or 100 genetic letters to be in the right place at the same time to work.
And here is the core statistical roadblock. The intermediate half-finished steps in that sequence are typically neutral, meaning they don't give any immediate advantage.
Or they're even deleterious. They're harmful.
Right. And natural selection can only see and select for the immediate beneficial step. Since those intermediate steps are neutral or harmful, natural selection is effectively blind to them.
So if selection is blind, the emergence of the needed sequence has to rely purely on random genetic drift.
Which, by definition, is infinitesimally slow.
It creates what's described as an informational bottleneck for the emergence of all complex biological features.
Let's apply this to the most sensitive area of all, what the sources call the hominin window absurdity.
The standard evolutionary model allots approximately 6 million years for the transition from a common primate ancestor to anatomically modern humans. That's the speed limit.
6 million years. That's the grand total the clock provides for the evolution of our entire genome, our intelligence, our bipedalism, everything that makes us human.
Now look at the numerical simulation data. Geneticists have performed these high-fidelity population models, looking at how long it takes for new functional mutations to appear and become fixed in a population the size of the supposed hominin lineage.
And the results are they're catastrophic for the timeline.
Utterly catastrophic. For a human-sized population, the waiting time required to fix a coordinated string of just 2 functional specific nucleotides is approximately 216 million years.
Just stop there for a second. Think about that magnitude.
2 coordinated specified changes require 216 million years, according to secular population models.
Yet the entire hominin story, which requires millions of coordinated changes, is supposed to happen in only 6 million years.
That ratio alone should signal a complete mathematical failure.
And the problem has gotten dramatically worse with new sequencing data. The old myth was that humans and chimpanzees were, 99% genetically identical?
The 1% myth, yes. But recent telomere-to-telomere, or T2T, sequencing of the ape genome, which properly includes previously unaligned regions, structural variations, all the gaps, has shattered that figure.
The T2T sequencing reveals a profound divergence.
The actual genetic difference between human and chimp genomes is now understood to be closer to 15%.
15%, which translates to over 400 million specific genetic differences, specific letters that have to be generated and fixed to bridge that gap.
So let's synthesize this. We have 6 million years available for the entire transition.
We need to author 400 million specific genetic letters.
But the math demonstrates that generating and fixing just 2 of those letters requires 216 million years.
The conclusion drawn by the sources is just uncompromising on this. They call it a mathematical absurdity. The deep time model simply cannot generate the required information at the necessary speed.
So if the numbers don't work, the secular community needs an escape hatch. And the common statistical evasion is the concept of exaptation.
The idea that complex structures weren't designed from scratch, but were borrowed from existing parts used for other functions.
The claim is that borrowing parts avoids that long waiting time. The classic example is the bacterial flagellum, the little rotary motor.
Right.
Evolutionary theorists suggest it borrowed components from something called the Type 3 secretory system, which is used like a tiny needle and syringe.
It's a powerful rebuttal on the surface, but the sources point out that this doesn't solve the core statistical problem, it just shifts it.
And this is the crucial interface problem. You can't just take a motor from one machine and plug it into a new chassis.
No, you need adapters.
You need specific, coordinated interface mutations, new proteins, new signaling systems to adapt these incompatible parts to fit together, to synchronize their timing, to regulate their assembly.
And the statistical probability of generating those interface mutations by chance
Is mathematically just as prohibitive as creating the original parts from scratch. It's an infinite regression of the same statistical problem.
This all boils down to what the sources identify as a linguistic hypocrisy in the gradualist claim. When they talk about selection, they'll dogmatically assert that evolution is not random because selection is involved.
But it's also not guided, because they dismiss any notion of a creator.
That puts the mechanism in a logical vacuum.
It does. If the process is unguided and mindless, it is, by definition, stochastic. It's random. When proponents claim that natural selection sculpts or builds complex systems, they're attributing godlike creative agency to what is a purely passive filter.
We have to maintain the proper definition here. Selection is a sieve, not a sculptor.
That's the key. It is purely subtractive. It kills the unfit. It possesses zero power to author the fit in the first place.
So attributing creative power to a blind sieve is, in the framework of the source material, replacing the sovereign king, the intelligent architect, with the idol of chance.
And the math shows that the complexity cannot be achieved without massive, non-random input.
Having audited the cosmological and genetic clocks, which we've seen are statistically shattered under the weight of the data, we now turn to the only remaining data type that can solve this historical inverse problem.
High-precision test value. This is the 577/86-year Mizora, what the sources call the witnessed horizon.
And this is a radical shift in thinking. We're moving from probabilistic extrapolation to forensic evidence.
And the sources argue that this chronological coordinate is not some vague folklore. It's a forensic legal constant, codified in the Seder Olam Rabbah and authenticated by Maimonides in the Mishnah Torah.
The precision of this timeline is absolute because it functions as a legal constant within a living, continuous national infrastructure.
That's right. Maimonides rules that any Jewish legal document, a bill of divorce, a get, or a commercial contract, a shtar with an invented, altered, or incorrect date, is legally void. It invalidates the entire transaction.
So the stability of the 5007-86-year chronology is verified daily by the strict requirements of commerce, family law, and ritual.
Unlike the 13.8 billion-year model, which is shattering under that 5 sigma discrepancy of the Hubble tension, the Jewish record stands as an immutable, high-precision signal secured by continuous legal custody.
And the origin of this absolute historical certainty, according to the sources, lies at the Sinai singularity.
The mass empirical experience of the Sinai event. This wasn't a private vision of a solitary figure. It was a national revelation witnessed by millions.
The records describe an event of such overwhelming ontological magnitude that the laws of physics seem to bend. There was a visible manifestation, a black fire on white fire that bored through the mountain.
And the visual field of every man, woman, and child was flooded with an empirical realization of angelic chariots descending.
And the acoustic intrusion was recorded as a force that exceeded human biological capacity. The Midrash records that the entire universe went into a state of absolute frozen silence.
No bird chirped, no bird flew, no ox bellowed.
Into this vacuum, the voice of the Creator blasted with a frequency so massive it physically shattered the cedar trees of Lebanon.
The source material suggests that the memory of this event is genetically and psychologically embedded in the nation. They survived an execution by holiness.
And the crucial argument is this: to suggest that a nation collectively invented a traumatic false memory of their own mass death and resurrection and then codified it into law.
Is a psychological anomaly more impossible than the event itself? This is the stable, high-precision signal that must override unconstrained, broken extrapolation.
Okay, now we have to address the corrupted data that the sources say necessitated the flood, the dinosaurs.
The sources provide an information-theoretic definition of these megafauna derived from ancient commentary.
Rashi's commentary, based on the Midrash Rabbah, explains the corruption of all flesh before the flood as animals mating outside their own species, the prohibition of kilayim.
And this was framed as an act of active bioterrorism, the systematic recoding of the biological kernel, merging distinct, optimized genomic lines to produce grotesque hybridizations.
Think of the kind, the min, as a closed, optimized software subroutine.
Okay.
Kilayim is the forced merging of the source code of two incompatible operating systems. The result is spaghetti code. It might technically function, but it's chaotic, unstable, and prone to glitch artifacts and illogical features.
And this maps perfectly onto the paleontological record of Dinosauria. These were creatures with exaggerated, functionally superfluous armor, illogical spikes, pathological gigantism.
They were the malware of the antediluvian world, living errors that violated the initialized protocol. They were never part of the authorized creation, but were corrupted variations of the original kinds.
So why didn't Noah save them on the Ark?
Because the Ark functioned as a biodigital cleanroom.
That is a fantastic analogy. How does the concept of a clean room apply here?
The Ark's purpose wasn't just preservation, it was purification. Noah was the systems administrator commanded to back up the original source code, the pure kinds initialized at the beginning, and leave the corrupted data on the local drive to be wiped.
The sources provide a dual indictment for their deletion. First, systemic corruption, as they actively corrupted their own nature.
And second, functional obsolescence.
Functional obsolescence,
Yeah.
meaning they were ill-suited for the new environment.
Exactly. The colossal reptiles were initialized or perhaps mutated into existence for the high-energy, high-vitality antediluvian world, which had an entirely different atmospheric and gravitational profile.
Once that operating system was purged by the flood,
These enormous legacy assets were incompatible with the lower-energy post-flood world and were, by necessity, purged from the system. The Ark was a restoration, not a comprehensive archive.
and this high-fidelity signal, the 5786-year timeline, is maintained via the Mizora, the unbroken chain of custody.
Maimonides' detailed audit describes a 40-stage chain from Moses at Sinai all the way to Rav Ashi, the final redactor of the Talmud.
This is essentially a distributed ledger, a decentralized verification system. It used redundant protocols and multiple witnesses to ensure Byzantine fault tolerance against data corruption.
The Mizora ensures that no single point of failure could break the transmission of the tradition and that chronological coordinate,
To successfully deny the Mizora, you have to believe in what the sources call a universal lie.
which is that an entire generation of parents collectively gaslit millions of their own children into accepting a traumatic false memory of slavery and revelation without leaving a single trace of dissent, protest, or counter-narrative in any surviving literature.
That sociological conspiracy is statistically and psychologically impossible,
Furthermore, the signal is validated by what the sources call hostile node verification.
where the enemy confirms the data.
Exactly. Secular scholars, even those who deny the Exodus, are forced to admit that the Egyptian names of the Levite leadership, Moshe, Phinehas, Merari, are authentic Egyptian linguistic fingerprints.
This admission constitutes a legal principle called mode bimixat, a partial admission. They admit the passport and the location are linguistically authentic. You cannot have the authentic Egyptian name Moshe with its high-ranking status and yet claim the person is a complete literary invention.
By identifying the authentic linguistic fingerprint of the protagonist and his contemporaries, the atheist inadvertently authenticates the entire biography. The names survive because the continuous historical record that transported them survived.
And we have hard archaeological anchors that defy these late-date forgery theories. The Mesha seal from the Moabites and the Teldan stele from the Arameans both confirm the existence of the House of David, verified by enemies who had zero incentive to propagate Jewish myth.
And most compellingly, the Kitef Hinnom silver scrolls, dating back to the 7th century BCE, prove that the priestly blessing from the Book of Numbers was already read-only and in liturgical use during the First Temple period.
Which single-handedly falsifies all the late-date forgery theories, which suggest that the Torah or its priestly materials were only compiled much later, during the time of Josiah or Ezra. The signal is verified by hostile witnesses and physical artifacts.
Okay, we've established the forensic certainty of the witness timeline and the mathematical failure of the deep time extrapolation. Now we have to move to the architecture of existence, the Kabbalistic framework that explains why the universe was initialized the way it was, and why that 13.8 billion year figure appears at all.
This section brings us to the highest level of metaphysics. We have to first revisit the critique of Occam's razor.
The idea that the simplest explanation is usually the best one.
Right, and the secular objection is always that invoking a creator introduces an entity infinitely more complex than the universe itself, which would violate parsimony.
But the sources argue that this is a fundamental category error. It views the creator as some kind of external supermechanism, subject to the same laws of complexity as the contingent universe.
In Jewish metaphysics, the creator occupies the realm of necessary existence. He's the axiomatic foundation upon which everything else is built. The ultimate reality, known as Awtsmoos, the essence, is defined as infinitely simple, pashat b'tachlis hapishitis.
What does pashat b'tachlis hapishitis, infinitely simple, actually mean in practical terms?
It means pure, absolute unity, an utter absence of differentiation or internal composition. The creator is not complex. Complexity is an attribute of the created. This infinitely simple being acts as the ultimate explanatory stop rule, achieving far greater parsimony than a universe laden with hundreds of inexplicable fundamental constants, infinite probabilistic hurdles for emergent life, and 95% unobserved dark energy.
The creation is complex, the creator is not.
Exactly. The transition from infinite simplicity to finite complexity required a massive philosophical operation, explained through the concepts of tzimtzum and continuous creation.
So initially, the Ohr Makif, the infinite light, filled all existence. There was simply no space for a finite, delineated reality.
Right. To create the universe, the infinite had to perform a tzimtzum, a contraction or concealment of its light, to create a shalal, a primordial void, where finite definitions and limits could exist.
So the universe is not some finished object that was wound up and just left to run down.
No, it's a sustained speech act that must be renewed by the creative force every single instant. Otherwise, it would collapse back into that void.
And the Tzimtzum created the kelim, the vessels or limits.
These vessels act as the instruction set architecture that defines the limits of physical law. Coach Egville, the power of limitation. This physical reality that we inhabit, the three spatial dimensions plus time, is categorized as the Malchut, or kingship, the world of Agia, the world of action.
So we exist at the final deployment layer of a long but finite chain of descent, the Seder Hishtalshalit.
And the 1567-86-year chronology is not the age of the idea of the universe, but the timestamp of this final operational deployment of physical reality.
This architecture is essential for resolving the age paradox, using the concept of daelion versus date tacton.
Higher knowledge versus lower knowledge.
Let's define these twin perspectives clearly for the listener. What is daelion?
Daelion is the perspective of the creator. From this perspective, the universe is not real in an autonomous sense. It is ayin, nullified non-existence, sustained solely by continuous will. Time is not a linear flow, but a singular point of will.
And dat tacton.
This is the perspective of the created being, the observer trapped within the system. From this viewpoint, the cosmos appears as yesh autonomous existence. It looks solid, permanent, and its reality is defined by the fixed laws of nature. This is the mode of concealment known as Teva.
And it's important to stress the sources say the sensation of a solid, autonomous world, this feeling of yesh, is metaphysically valid.
It is. It's rooted in the essence of the creator, the only true existence. The world is solid because its root is the infinite.
But here's the critical distinction. The 13.8 billion year narrative arises when the observer, trapped within that date tacton perspective, applies the broken yardstick of uniformitarianism to this profound metaphysical feeling of yesh.
The observer confuses ontological depth, the immense weight of the essence, and the informational maturity required for the system to be functional, with chronological length.
So the universe feels infinite, stable, and heavy, not because it's chronologically old,
But because its root is the necessary existent.
So 13.8 billion years, therefore, is the hallucination of autonomy.
It's the inevitable syntax error returned by a mind that cannot distinguish between the weight of existence and the linear flow of time. The number exists only in the confused mind of the observer, who mistakes the system's mode of concealment, Teva, for its actual history.
This metaphysical framework helps explain why some physical anomalies persist, even in the modern scientific narrative. We mentioned the maturity crisis with the red monster galaxies, but we can also look at the faint young sun paradox.
That paradox states that if the Earth and Sun system had been running uniformly for 4 billion years, the Sun's luminosity would have been 30% lower back then.
Which means Earth should have been frozen solid.
Below the freezing point of water, yes, which would prevent the emergence of liquid, water-dependent life in the first place.
And to resolve this, standard science has to invent an auxiliary hypothesis of some extreme primordial greenhouse effect without any direct long-term geochemical evidence.
Whereas the initialization model solves this instantly. The Earth and Sun were simply initialized in functional thermal equilibrium. They started ready.
And we can return to the hard evidence of soft tissue and endogenous proteins found in Mesozoic fossils, supposedly millions and millions of years old.
The Arrhenius equation dictates that these proteins should reach complete, irreversible degradation significantly faster than the millions of years indicated by the geological timeline.
The presence of preserved collagen and other soft tissues is a direct physical falsification of the chronological scale itself. Time is supposed to be the universal solvent, and its failure to dissolve these complex organic structures proves the yardstick is broken.
It all converges. The 13.8 billion year figure is a calculated failure. It's a number that requires 95% of the universe to be made of unobserved dark placeholders and demands massive statistical improbabilities as shown by the waiting time problem.
The initialization model concentrates the complexity at the origin, the architectural miracle, and uses the high-precision historical data as its anchor.
The core conflict is philosophical. It rests on two different sets of starting axioms. The secularist prioritizes the simplicity of the gradual process, even if that process requires infinite statistical luck and the invention of massive dark sectors.
And the initialization model prioritizes the completeness of the initial explanation, anchored by the witness signal of 5,786 years.
In this framework, the 13.8 billion year narrative isn't a history of previous secondary worlds. It is a total systemic failure of the observer's logic. It's the mathematical mirage as an observer who fails to inquire into the essential nature of the origin and who confuses the weight of existence with the flow of time.
We've completed our forensic audit. We began by auditing the cosmological clocks, seeing the Hubble Tension crisis and the absurdity of the dark sector placeholders. We then moved to the genetic clocks, where the waiting time problem demonstrated the sheer mathematical impossibility of authoring 400 million specific genetic changes in 6 million years when just 2 changes require 216 million years.
And we secured the historical coordinate of 500 and 786 years through the Mizora, a cryptographically sound 40-stage chain of custody, validated by the daily legal requirements of a living nation and verified by hostile historical nodes and archaeological anchors. The choice is ultimately between two modes of faith: accepting the calculated failure, the 13.8 billion years requiring massive statistical improbabilities, or accepting the witnessed reality, 500, 786 years, anchored by a singular initial act of architecture.
I think the most profound synthesis here is the one about logic itself. The materialist who uses logic and reason to deny the creator is, according to the sources, caught in a profound epistemic suicide.
Right. If the human mind is nothing more than the accidental byproduct of mutating wetware, a neurochemical spasm selected only for biological survival, not for objective truth, then the conclusion, there is no creator, has no more objective validity than a preference for chocolate ice cream.
To argue that their atheism is true requires implicitly stealing the divine spark of objective logic, which their own materialistic worldview denies exists.
They are sawing off the very branch they sit on. They're borrowing the intellectual capital of the creator to fund their denial of him.
We are not asked to abandon reason, but to follow the data.
And the data, whether it's through the mathematical precision required of the genetic code, the absurdity of the cosmological constants, or the immutable historical witness, points directly to the author and his timeline.
Therefore, the final provocative thought we leave you with is this. Consider that hostile node verification again. The secular archaeologist identifies the authentic Egyptian linguistic fingerprint of the protagonist, Moshe, and must admit that the figure existed as a high-ranking Egyptian official. By admitting the authenticity of the messenger's identity, the archaeologist inadvertently authenticates the entire biography he intends to deny.
The denial of the 5,786-year record is exposed not as a necessary scientific conclusion, but as a volitional act of filtering information. The evidence isn't hidden. The observer simply lacks the will to accept the implications of the proof he possesses, preferring the hallucination of autonomy to the reality of the witnessed horizon. The question ultimately is not what the universe is made of, but who wrote the source code. And the timeline, secured by law and memory, provides the author's definitive timestamp.